Paulus Berensohn, The Pebble Ritual, was prepared by S.Portico Bowman. She is a writer, artist, and professor at Pittsburgh State University. I'm Tom Yeshe, the narrator and the person who introduced Portico to the life and work of Paulus in 2017. The rest is now history and soon to be a book by Portico with the title Dig, Paulus Berensohn, A Natural Life.
I mean, you see the face of an artist and you know that they have a connection to a deeper place.
Making objects from clay is an intimate placeholder in a world gone wired and wild. Paulus Berensohn would gently remind his students, colleagues, and himself that the etymological root of the word art means to join. Berensohn's clarion call was to transform art from a noun into a verb. His Pebble Ritual was the way his students could join their passion for art making into a lifeline of experience. In 1990, Jerry Williams commissioned Berensohn to prepare a talk for a Studio Potter fundraiser. Berensohn titled the essay, Silica, Alumina, Rapture, and Awe. These were the ingredients most important for his clay formula. However, the materialistic bias of society does not recognize the importance of rapture and awe. Berensohn writes, when you forfeit your sense of awe, everything becomes the marketplace. The Pebble Ritual was Berensohn's wedge between the pressures of institutional careerism, artistic insecurity, and materialism. He sought words and means to protect the artist from turning clay into polyethylene bags of stuff when what they sought was the touch of stardust. All of the images, unless noted, are the work of Paulus. Dare we say, even the meteorites, gemstones, and bits of stardust that you will see, perhaps made by him at another time in another form. Thomas Merton writes, there is a pervasive form of contemporary violence to which the idealist most easily succumbs: activism and overwork. The rush and pressure of modern life are a form, and perhaps the most common form, of innate violence. To allow oneself to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, to surrender to too many demands, to commit oneself to do too many projects, to want to help everyone and everything, is to succumb to violence. More than that, it is cooperation in violence. The frenzy of the activists neutralizes their work. It destroys the fruitfulness of their own work because it kills the root of inner wisdom which makes work fruitful. We are here saturated in conversation and concern about the end of the world while living through a middle world of COVID-19. We are also interested in a conversation about the new world. Susie Gablick, philosopher, art critic, colleague, and peer of Paulus, writes in Art in the Age of Ecology, it seems frightening that the most enduring monuments that the West will leave behind for future generations will not be Stonehenge, the pyramids of Giza, or the Cathedral of Chartres, but rather the hazardous remains of our industry and technology, vast gardens of ashes and poisons. This legacy is ours. Individuality and freedom have been the great achievements of modern culture, and in recent decades, a kind of art answering only to its own laws. Can we really say any longer that the state of the world has no important bearing on the works of art which artists create, or that the several selves of an artist, or indeed of anyone, can be kept separate anymore? Art may never save the world, but saving the world is not the same as saving the phenomenon world itself, which is something art can do. Art can help us recollect our belongingness to something precious and worthy of protection. Rick Tarnas, in conversation with Irvin Laszlo, Susie Gablick, and Anna Perez Christie, says, all of us in this room agree that another epistemological shift is taking place to which we are making a contribution. At the heart of this epistemological shift is a moral shift. We moved from an interdependent relationship with the universe to an independent relationship to the universe with deeply problematic consequences. Scientists say the Copernican revolution was the central turning point of Western history. Everything led up to it, everything comes out of it. Tarnas says, I have always wondered about the paradox of changing the center of the universe. Then one day I was reading a column in the New York Times written by Anna Quinlan. It was Mother's Day. She was in San Francisco. Her children were in New York. She said something that clarified the paradox. She writes, you know, the center of the child's universe is the mother. I knew right away this was true and recognized in terms of the Copernican revolution. It was not human beings who used to be the center of the universe. It was the earth that was the center, and the movement of the Copernican revolution was away from the mother, away from Mother Earth, Mother Nature, the matrix of life. David Abrams' book, The Spell of the Sensuous, published in 1996, had a significant impact on Paulus. They shared correspondence and conversation aligned around their views on deep ecology and the nature of the senses. They were kindred spirits. What follows is an extended excerpt from portions of Abrams' book, offered in honor of their relationship and the significance of Abrams' work on overall themes presented here. Abram writes, the complex interchange that we call language is rooted in the nonverbal exchange always already going on between our own flesh and the flesh of the world. Human languages, then, are informed not only by the structures of the human body and the human community, but by the evocative shapes and patterns of the more than human terrain. Experientially considered, language is no more the special property of the human organism than it is an expression of the animate earth that enfolds us. How can we account for our culture's experience of other animals as senseless automata or of trees as purely passive fodder for lumber mills? If perception in its depths is wholly participatory, how could we ever have broken out of those depths into the inert and determinate world we now commonly perceive? Abrams says, surprisingly, that the loss of participation has something to do with language. Language has the profound ability to turn back upon and influence our sensorial experience.
I think we should be quiet now. Oh, snake, come crawling until I can see the light in your eyes. Bite me, excite me, so that I can understand you, stand under you. Your venom transforms me, brings an eternal fire that connects me to the powers of creation and heals me again and again.
Poet Gary Snyder writes, lifting a brush, a burren, a pen, or a stylus is like releasing a bite or lifting a claw. Abram goes on, European civilization's neglect of the natural world and its needs has clearly been encouraged by a style of awareness that disparages sensorial reality, denigrating the visible and tangible order of things on behalf of some absolute source assumed to exist entirely beyond or outside of the bodily world. The ancient Hebrews, on the one hand, and the ancient Greeks, on the other, are variously taken to task for providing the mental context that would foster civilization's mistreatment of non-human nature. In every other respect, these two traditions, each one originating out of its own specific antecedents and in its own terrain and time, were vastly different. In every other respect, that is, but one, they were both, from the start, profoundly informed by writing. Indeed, they both made use of the strange and potent technology which we have come to call the alphabet. Born of the interplay between the human and the more than human world, language is derived from the earthly terrain and is filled with marks, calligraphy, scrawls, traces, rivers, arroyos, and canyons. Archaeological evidence shows that we survived for 1 million years reading those traces. The Greek alphabet was first invented, or rather adapted, from the Semitic Aleph Beth several centuries before Plato. But the new technology did not spread rapidly through Greece. The sung stories, along with numerous ceremonies to which they were linked, were in a sense the living encyclopedia of the culture. Carrying and preserving the collected knowledge and established customs of the community occurred through constant repetition and ritual reenactment. At first, there was little overt need for the new technology of reading and writing. In fact, there was remarkable resistance in the form of a highly developed and ritualized oral culture. The chanted tales carried the nested narrative and much of the accumulated knowledge of the culture. Since they were not written down or fixed, the stories would shift and change to include what was relevant, and the obsolete would fall away. Eric Havelock said that it was 300 years before the alphabet gained a place in society. The elite of the society were reciters and performers. The alphabet was an interloper. When the animate powers that surround us are suddenly construed as having less significance than ourselves, when the generative earth is abruptly defined as a determinate object devoid of its own sensation and feelings, then the sense of a wild and multiplicitous otherness in relation to which human existence has always oriented itself must migrate either into a supersensory heaven beyond the natural world, or else into the human skull itself, the only allowable refuge in this world for what is ineffable and unfathomable. Truth is no longer connected to the experience of the people. It becomes recorded and made permanent on stones, tablets, parchment, paper, and now gigabytes. Language can make things up, and it does all the time, but now the stories become permanent fixtures, and unlike an oral culture, they do not evolve with experience. Stories can be planted like a virus and proliferate like a new disease to manipulate other humans or destroy the non-human world. Ever since Aristotle, philosophers have been concerned to demonstrate in the most convincing manner possible that human beings are significantly different from all other forms of life. It was not enough to demonstrate that human beings were unique, for each species is evidently unique in its way. Rather, it was necessary to show that the human form was uniquely unique, that our noble gifts set us definitively apart from and above the rest of the animate world. Such demonstrations were, we may suspect, needed to justify the increasing manipulation and exploitation of non-human nature by and for civilized humans. The necessity for such philosophical justification became especially urgent in the wake of the scientific revolution, when our capacity to manipulate other organisms increased 100-fold. Descartes' radical separation of the immaterial human mind from the wholly mechanical world of nature did much to fill this need. He provided a splendid rationalization for the vivisection experiments that soon began to proliferate. However, with the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species and The Descent of Man, a profound tension was introduced into the anthropocentric trajectory of European philosophy and science. If humans or animals evolved like other animals, if indeed fish are our distant ancestors and mice our cousins, then our own traits and capacities must be, to some degree, continuous with those found in the rest of the early environment. Most scientists, while accepting Darwin's theories, were reluctant to relinquish the assumption of human specialness. The assumption alone justifies so many of the cultural and research practices to which we have now become accustomed. In our time, it is language conceived as an exclusively human property that is most often used to demonstrate the excellence of the human relative to all other species. So, just by conceiving language as a purely abstract phenomenon, cut off from the indebtedness of human language to the more than human perceptual field, an indebtedness preserved in the names and shapes of the Semitic letters, the ox and the aleph, is now entirely forgotten. When it is possible to overlook the sensuous, evocative dimension of human discourse and attend solely to the denotative and conventional aspect of verbal communication, then it is possible, easy, and now normal to hold ourselves apart from and outside of the rest of animate nature. Whereas in indigenous oral cultures, language is not experienced as the exclusive property of humankind, but as the property of the sensuous life world. The deeply mysterious powers and entities with whom the shaman enters into a rapport are ultimately the same forces, the same plants, animals, forests, and winds that to literate, civilized Europeans are just so much scenery, the pleasant backdrop of our more pressing human concerns. The most sophisticated definition of magic that now circulates through the American counterculture is the ability or power to alter one's consciousness at will. No mention is made of any reason for altering one's consciousness. Yet in tribal cultures, that which we call magic takes its meaning from the fact that humans in an indigenous and oral context experience their own consciousness as simply one form of awareness among many others. Only by temporarily shedding the accepted perceptual logic of his culture can the sorcerer hope to enter into relation with other species on their own terms. Only by altering the common organization of their senses will they be able to enter into a rapport with the multiple non-human sensibilities that animate the local landscape. It is this, we might say, that defines a shaman. They enjoy the ability to readily slip out of perceptual boundaries that demarcate his or her particular culture. Boundaries reinforced by social customs, taboos, and most importantly, the common speech or language in order to make contact with and learn from the other powers in the land. Their magic is precisely this heightened receptivity to the meaningful solicitations, songs, cries, gestures of the larger, more than human field. To be sure, the shaman's ecological function is not obvious at first blush, even to a sensitive observer. We see the sorcerer being called upon to cure an ailing tribesman of his sleeplessness or locate some missing goods. We witness them entering into trance and sending their awareness into other dimensions in search of insight and aid, or in other words, pertaining to the shamanic function of the artist, to make the tea set for the Christmas sale, a ceramic sculpture for the foyer, show up to teach hand-building 101, getting behind the potter's wheel, wedging the clay, handing out the syllabus, watching the light like the silica's moist ledge, taming the fire to tip the cone at the exact moment, sitting the student down to talk.
The whole curriculum would deal with the senses. I think that the human senses are the umbilical cords that connect us to deep ecology, and that Western science has cheated us by listing only 5. Occasionally they'll talk about the 6th sense, the kinesthetic sense, which they sort of talk about as if it weren't that important. Little do they know. 5 senses doesn't even begin to, for many years Rudolf Steiner has a palette of 12 senses that I've been studying for years and is wonderful and thrilling. But Guy Murchie has 32. And recently when I was in Eugene, Oregon, I came across the World Peace University, which I'd never heard of, and there's a man named Michael Cohen who has a list of 52 all-species senses. So the curriculum of my graduate school of art would be to re-educate the senses. And because of that, I asked my friend Judith Gladowitz to come to this weekend with me so that tomorrow when we work with the play, Judith is an Alexander technique teacher. Alexander lived and worked at the same time that Rudolf Steiner lived and worked. And although they didn't know each other and they were very different kinds of people, Steiner was a clairvoyant mystic and Alexander was a genius bookie. He was sort of a dandy who loved the races, but he had this genius that he knew about the body and how it worked. And he taught us how to open ourselves to the 4 body senses. There isn't only a kinesthetic sense, there are 4 body senses. And what Steiner has demonstrated to me is that it's the body senses that are the threshold to the spiritual world. Now, I didn't understand that when I first came across that the body was the threshold of the spiritual world. But when I use that expression, our little bit of being, when the sense of touch, which is the first sense, when the sense of touch is developed, we bring the subjective world we bring the objective world into the subjective world. And that's the beginning of our spiritual life. And the sense of touch is the most endangered sense in the 20th century. That's one of the reasons that we have resurfaced. We potters are not here to fill the marketplace. We're here because we are in trouble and the world needs healing, and clay and yarn and metals are healing materials. And we have a healing function. I'm convinced of it. It doesn't mean that we don't make pots and sell them, but we have to fill the pots with the myth that M.C. Richards talks about, and make the meal holy. And all we have to do is pause for a second like the Balinese and just know it for a second. Thank the clay. If once a day, thank the clay. It would be a revolution if every potter in America just thanked his clay. I'd like to end by putting one of my pots in your hands. I don't fire my pots anymore, but I had to fire this one to bring it to you. So I this fired it. And, pass this from hand to hand. This is one of a series of raw offering bowls that I make, inspired by my experience in Bali. I try to make one every day. And I'll speak more about them tomorrow. But they have biodynamic earth healing preparations wedged into the clay. But you can hold it and pass it on. This is a pot made in collaboration with Jane Pizer. It's porcelain, and you know, Jane, those of you who know Jane's work, this is colored porcelain clay that she's rolled up, and she makes like glass blowers make a marini. You know that they'll put pipes of colored glass and then slice it, and that's what Jane's work is extraordinary. She's often dismissed. She isn't in the mainstream because people think of her work as being cute, but you have to really look. Jane Pizer is a remarkable ecological potter, and the imagery on her work has always been of earth spirits, divas. And I'm probably the only one who's ever seen it, and that's why I wanted to work with her. And so we've made this. It took me a year to learn to pinch her clay. It has no plasticity at all. She uses a very short porcelain, but Mary Rain, who had me come to Powabik for 2 weeks this winter, told me about fiber. And so I put fiber in the clay, and I can now. But you might want to look at this. This is stoneware, high-fired, and then fired 3 or 4 more times for the losses and gold. Thank you all for coming and sitting this long with the mosquitoes.
Lewis Hyde, perhaps best known for his best-selling book, The Gift, also wrote Trickster Makes This World, Mischief, Myth, and Art. Here, Hyde unpacks in ways as interesting as could be found an analysis of ritual that broadens our perspective of ritual practice, inspires one, or perhaps helps someone notice a ritual practice they already have. This presentation on the role of ritual seeks to go beyond a cliché travelogue of photos of famous sites, such as more pictures of Stonehenge. We are here to look for ways and means to navigate life, and if possible, figure out solid ways to prepare to die. Hyde writes, "In this world, everything that feeds will someday be food for other mouths. That is the law of appetite, or, as we'd now say, of ecological interdependence. There are moments when the practice of art and the trickster myth coincide. I hold the trickster stories up against specific cases of the imagination in action, hoping that each might illuminate the other. If the method works, it is not because I have uncovered the true story behind a particular work of art, but more simply the coincidences are fruitful, making us think and see again. Such goals are keeping with trickster's spirit, for trickster is the archetype who attacks all archetypes. Trickster is the character in myth who threatens to take the myth apart. Trickster is an eternal state of mind that is suspicious of all eternals, dragging them from their heavenly preserve to see how they fare down here in this time-haunted world. Every group has its edge, its sense of in and out. Trickster is always there at the gates of the city and the gates of life. Trickster attends the internal boundaries by which groups articulate their social life. Right and wrong, sacred and profane, clean and dirty, male and female, young and old, living and dead. And in every case, trickster will cross the line and confuse the distinction. Trickster is the creative idiot, therefore the wise fool, the gray-haired baby, the cross-dresser, the speaker of sacred profanities. A trickster does not live near the hearth, nor does he live in the halls of justice, the soldier's tent, the shaman's hut, the monastery. He passes through each of these when there is a moment of silence, and he enlivens each with mischief, but he is not their guiding spirit. Trickster is the spirit of the doorway leading out and of the crossroad at the edge of town. Trickster is the spirit of the road at dusk, the one that runs from one town to another and belongs to neither. There are strangers on that road and thieves, and in the underbrush a sly beast whose stomach has not heard about your letters of safe passage. Travelers used to mark such roads with cairns, each adding a stone to the pile in passing. The name Hermes once meant he of the stone heap, which tells us that the cairn is more than a trail marker. It is an altar to the forces that govern these spaces of heightened uncertainty and to the intelligence needed to negotiate them. Hitchhikers who make it safely home have somewhere paid homage to Hermes. Eating and death are part of the world of change, just as their suppression would be part of changeless perfection. In the hymn to Hermes, Hermes invents the art of sacrifice, and he does so out of a struggle over appetite. He is preparing himself to be an Olympian. To eat meat is to be confined to the mortal realm, and Hermes has higher goals. He doesn't want to be a cave boy. He'd rather be a shining prince. He is hungry for the food of the gods, the fruits of sacrifice and prayer, not the meat itself. By not eating, it's as if he's sacrificing his own intestines along with the meat, denying his salivary glands in favor of his heart's pride. If tricksters are initially ridden by their appetites, and if such compulsion leads them into traps, then we might read intentional sacrifice as an attempt to alter appetite, to eat without compulsion. The trickster's stories imagine a final escape from the eating game, and beyond the edge of the predator-prey relationship, immortal eaters feast on heavenly foods and never themselves become a meal for worms or for time. 99% of the universe is in darkness. Stones were the first inhabitants to carry the light born as they are in the primal fire of creation. Barry Lopez writes, "Stones, the first beings to carry the light, are the last to let it go. You will see them flare and burn like coals before they go out." A lump of clay will glow with ultraviolet energy for a month if you hit it with a hammer. Paulus says, there is a sense in which we are being played through. Person personatus, to be sounded. He says, we think we chose clay and life as an artist consciously, when it may well be we were chosen or kidnapped by a dynamic larger than our personal needs, chosen by the earth, for instance, to serve her, to help her heal in this time of escalating eco-catastrophe. It is as clay's consort that we are compelled to behave artistically on her behalf to save her life. The species' knowledge of the clay itself is the wisdom you are touching. Paulus tells us that stones are the first embodiment of matter. He invites you to adorn your necklace of consciousness with the eye as tongue, licking and tasting the light. He tells us over and over again that every finger has 90,000 sense receptors, and emphatically reminds us that we are losing our imagination for the earth and for touch. The Pebble Ritual was Berenson's invitation to become a cosmonaut without ever leaving the earth. In fact, The Pebble Ritual is an example of how you can go the furthest out by coming the closest in. Berensohn, or the celebrant, as his notes direct, asks the participants to take about 3/4 of a pound of clay and hold it, sense it, behold it. The celebrant demonstrates 2 or 3 or even 4 ways to make 12 pebbles in ascending size. Participants then place their pebbles in any configuration but a straight line in graduating order. When everyone is finished, the celebrant asks, "Do you remember when we lived in the cave? These were our first playthings, pebbles as free toys, a gift of nature. All we had were pebbles and our imaginations. Now we have mathematics and architecture." The celebrant then asks everyone to form a circle. The center of the group has now become an altar. Starting with the leader, the pebbles are gathered up and set down in a new pattern. Each participant, in turn, adds their 12 pebbles, and the arrangement transforms in a kaleidoscope of choices. The ritual closes with votive candles placed and lit, and if appropriate, the room lights are turned off. The participants and the celebrant take hands and perform a simple circle dance or slow walk around the spontaneous pattern that has appeared. The dry clay on your fingers becomes moist again through the touch of another hand. You lose sight of your pebbles as the circle turns. It's not a burden to surrender ownership of your 12 orbs. The collective arrangement is the star altar of the ancestors. The ceremony closes when the celebrant reads the poem Stone by Charles Simic. Go inside a stone. That would be my way. Let somebody else become a dove or gnash with a tiger's tooth. I am happy to be a stone. From the outside, the stone is a riddle. No one knows how to answer it. Yet within, it must be cool and quiet, even though a cow steps on it full weight, even though a child throws it in a river. The stone sinks slow, unperturbed to the river bottom, where the fishes come to knock on it and listen. I have seen sparks fly out when 2 stones are rubbed, so perhaps it is not dark inside after all. Perhaps there is a moon shining from somewhere, as though behind a hill, just enough light to make out the strange writings, the star charts on the inner walls. Meteorites on their way to get groceries or gather more speed plowed into Australia, Mexico, and South Dakota. Scientists have gathered this celestial booty into display cases at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. Sheared smooth to show off the unbroken Widmanstatten pattern, their devastating beauty is stacked and caged and put on view like wild tigers in the zoo. There are septillion planets and 100 million galaxies. Earth was an unfortunate place for these meteorites to land. Other more progressive Milky Ways wouldn't have considered these oversized rocks something to trap and display. Someone big and tall with hair under their arms or on their back could have picked up these rare shards and tossed them away like fish that no one really needed. But old habits die hard or don't die at all. Humans are greedy. We don't often replace what we take from the earth or the sky. Civilized societies believe museums are the best place to see the beginning of time. In copious and detailed notes for every workshop Berensohn would teach, he'd metaphorically prick his finger with a miniature silver sword and dot every person, page, and piece to remind them what the indigenous people always have known and don't want to forget. We are punctuated by stardust stranded in bodies of flesh, bone, and ignorance. Amnesia of this truth is the roadblock to infinity, and Berensohn lived to remind us of this, one workshop at a time, one pebble ritual at a time. That there are stars in the stones, my teacups, the ventricles fastened to my heart valves and strung through my body like patio lights. He would say, I can see remnants of their light on the tips of my lips. I don't know if I believe that, but I want to. Glitter and the gloss at the cosmetic counter tastes bad, and I want to live a natural life. In the early morning of February 8, 1969, a brilliant fireball exploded over northern Mexico, momentarily turning night into day. Thousands of meteorite fragments rained down on the desert. Allende material was distributed to scientists in 37 labs in 13 countries. The massive research effort that followed revealed that Allende holds samples of our solar system's first solid grains. This milky white fluid contains 1.2 milligrams of incredibly small diamond crystals forged in the explosion of a dying star. Blasted across space, they were incorporated in the cloud that gave birth to our solar system. Without any doubt, this is the oldest material you'll ever see. It is older than the solar system itself. Giant chunks of meteoric ore bear the iron that makes blood and clay red, puts pink in the cheeks of children, color in our glaze, and provides the ochre used by the Aboriginal Dreamtime ceremonies that Berensohn revered. Aborigines have always respected the force of magnetic energy, and they recognize the capacity of blood and red ochre to increase their sensitivity to it. Ochre on skin provides the conduit of transformation and healing in their ecstatic rituals. Iron is the core of all celestial bodies. Joanna Macy says, the life pouring through us, pumping our heart and breathing through our lungs, did not begin at our birth or conception. Like every particle and every atom and molecule of our bodies, it goes back through time to the first splitting, spinning of the stars. Deborah Haynes, in Beginning Again, Reflections on Art as Spiritual Practice, writes, ritual begins with the body where breath and breathing are thresholds between the body and the mind. Most rituals include at least 6 elements. 1. Rituals have their own language, words, postures, movements, and gestures. 2. Rituals involve symbolic action. 3. Ritual is repetitive action carried out again and again. 4. Ritual is formal. It requires a form that is capable of bearing both the content and context from which it grows. 5. They may be communal or solitary. 6. Ritual is transformative. Ritual time is outside the usual activities of one's mundane life, yet it has an impact on the felt sense of daily life. She says, we make and remake our life through ritual. Haynes continues, imagination is as intrinsic to our nature as heat is to flame. It inhabits us as people inhabit the land, and we need it. For only the imagination allows us to contemplate the future without forgetting the past. Making art can help to create ritual space, and art can be created in a ritual fashion. She suggests, become conscious of the personal rituals that already shape your work and your life. Consider what rituals might support your creativity in the studio. How do you enter the studio? Might you create an altar? Do you already have an area that serves as an altar, although you might not call it that? Paulus writes in his notes for his shining clay workshop, "The art of the altar began 95,000 years ago. The Neanderthals placed stones with bones to make connections to the ancestors, the invisible world, the past, the future, to dreams and time. The altar is an archetype for the center of a prayer circle. Every time we gather to create an altar, the altar becomes the center of the universe." He goes on to say that ritual belongs at one and the same time to the world of sense and the world of spirit. Abrams says, "Vowels are nothing other than sounded breath, and breath the very mystery of life and awareness, a mystery inseparable from the invisible, holy wind or spirit. Our Om, our Amen." Ritual, Paulus liked to say, comes from rite, which he translated as to dance with beauty or grace and dignity, or that which illuminates transitions. Tsuji left a lasting contribution, constructing his very own aesthetic known as akaru sabi, literally meaning light. Sabi refers to the sunrise, quiet, restrained, serene. Tsuji put the most emphasis on the bottom of the interior. He regarded it as a mirror which reflects the potter himself. He said, "I devote myself, I put my whole personal history into the pot." Maya Nishi, writing in Ceramics, Art and Perception, says, "He uses the flame as a brush on the piece, just like a pen does on a drawing, as if it is a stroke of lightning. His pots do not merely satisfy the physical needs as a container, but seem to be the fundamental essence of living itself." Martin Prechtel, a modern-day shaman trained by Nicolas Chivilieu, one of the greatest Tsujujil Mayan shamans in Guatemala, says that a gift must be given to that which gives you life, and that preferably this gift be handmade, because that is the one thing the spirits do not have. Ritual gifts are the spiritual economy of the village.
I remember just having this epiphany. Nature is so much more creative than I could ever be. I'm Courtney Madison. I'm an artist and ocean advocate. I feel so lucky to have been invited by Oceanic Society to visit Raja Ampat now and see one of the last really healthy coral reef ecosystems on our planet. The first thing that people often don't realize is that corals are animals. They live in colonies of hundreds or thousands of individuals all on one piece that looks like a rock. Coral reefs cover less than 0.1% of the seafloor, but they actually support 25% of life in the ocean. Combining science and art is a powerful way to represent the fact that coral reefs are at a turning point. When I design a work, I start with a sketch. It's a combination of real-life inspiration and a conceptual background. Ultimately, creating a gigantic wall relief can take 8 months to a year. I think of my work as building monuments to coral reefs. in celebration of their beauty and their fragility and their value. When someone looks at one of my works, I hope that they'll be kind of seduced by the colorful, healthy corals at the heart of the swirl. And then I hope they'll stand back and realize what's happening.
Berensohn says in Silica, Alumina, Rapture, and Awe, Revisioning Clay Imaginatively, a talk he gave for Jerry Williams in 1990, that when he puts his hands on the clay to take it on, it takes him like a seizure and an embrace both in the body and in mind. Art is not a talent that is given to us, but a way of joining experience that is available to all. It's clay's peculiar ability to mix disorder with order that most intrigues scientists. Now that we know that the earth is alive, interdependent, and in continuous creation, what is the living function of a dynamic clay in the breathing soil? I ask the question everywhere. I pause to ask it of the clay as I work with it. Clay is a free service provided by the earth, a service, not a commodity. Courtney writes, I often say that I feel like a coral when I'm creating my work. I admire corals for their ability to be tiny, quiet sculptors of some of Earth's most gigantic and ecologically important living structures. Paulus says, if vibrant clay is Earth's gift to potters, then it behooves us to know the gift and the giver, to love them, listen to them, thank and praise in our work. The clues coming toward us from the secret life of clay, mediated by imaginations, put us in direct physical touch with the deeper story of a fuller ecology. Clay is our way of knowing and our way of healing our separation from deep nature. Potter and poet-philosopher M.C. Richards writes in her poem Potter, this flat plate, this ladle and bowl, clay whirled on a wheel, raised slowly to the table, straight and curved, our primal gestures take and give, speak out about the way we stand and breathe. Every leaf is saucer for the bread, every falling drop prepares its cup. Always we are eating and drinking Earth's body, making her dishes. Potters like sun and stars perform their art. Endowed with myth, they make the meal holy. Paulus would remind us of the three graces. There was a ritual to bring you here. There is a ritual to open our senses. There is a ritual to hear the true meaning of words. Rachel Naomi Remen, in conversation with Richard Whittaker, said, I think the survival of human races goes back to a much deeper level of our humanity, and compassion is part of that. Science is very seductive. It offers us the dream of mastery. But we've traded mystery for mastery, and we've gotten a very bad deal from this. It has put the entire planet in peril and every life form on it. Susie Gablett calls for art that is moved by empathic attunement to help create an inspired ethos of generosity and caring. This, Gablett says, is how we save the world. Lynn Hull makes art for wildlife in the form of small sculptural enhancements. Her first work of trans-species art consisted of spiral-shaped pockets called hydroglyphs that were carved in rocks in Utah and Wyoming. These small trenches serve as catchments of drinking water for desert animals. Hull considers her work eco-tonements. Catherine Ingram, a former journalist specializing in issues of consciousness and activism, suspects we are facing extinction in the near future and that it might be similar to hearing about a diagnosis of late-stage pancreatic cancer. Ingram considers the fury in seeing the desecration of the natural world due to human activity on the planet. She says, "It seems tragically unfair that one species could cause the elimination of almost all the others." And she says we grieve because we love. Ingram asks, "What else is there to do now?" She writes, "For nearly 30 years I've led public sessions and silent retreats around the world. In those gatherings, I encourage people to manage their own attention by moving it into present awareness, gratitude, and an immersion in the senses. Developing the habit of redirecting your awareness when your mind is lost in fear or troubling stories induces confidence. Your attention starts to incline toward ease more frequently. You find that you can choose calm. You can choose gratitude. You can choose love." Jonathan Franzen, winner of the National Book Award, writes in his book, The End of the Earth, "Even in a world of dying, new loves continue to be born." Michelangelo's monumental David was set free by the sculptor's belief he was inside the stone. His unfinished slaves bear witness to this process. Berensohn excavated his life from the boundaries of ego and matter. Painter Enrique Martinez Celaya asks regarding Michelangelo's Pietà, "Is it marble? Is it death? Is it loss? Is it compassion?" The power of the sculpture rises from the coexistence of all these questions. Berensohn's confidence in the fulcrum of creativity removed the barriers to a fulfilling life. He embodied an infinite intelligence able to emoliate self-doubt. His life became emblematic of a liberated soul. Thoughtful and assured, like the Renaissance sculptor, Berensohn, in the same way, through his creative work and play, explores birth, death, loss, and love. In this regard, his legacy is a singular, majestic dedication to the free movement of the mind, body, and spirit. However, the finished David is not formed without the necessary tools. Michelangelo's greatest obstacle was the very material he worked with. It was Nietzsche who said that the greatest work of the philosopher is their life. S.Portico Bowman has begun writing a book called Dig, Paulus Berensohn, A Natural Life, based upon Berensohn's unpublished, handwritten, 116-page memoir, The Silver Sword. In 1974, Paulus thought he was dying. He sold his share of the Pennsylvania farm, left North Carolina in secret, and drove to San Diego in search of healing. Berensohn's text recounts the period from 1974 to 1982, when he discovered the craft of Bargello tapestry. Stitch by stitch, breath by breath, Berensohn was restored to harmony and health, while the first whimpers of the pending and now full-blown climate crisis could be heard. Half a century later, Berensohn's healing Arcadia frames the path to ecological recovery on a global scale. Dig is first and foremost about the man, but Bowman's story becomes intricately woven to the settling ethos of the countercultural revolution and the burgeoning awareness that Mother Earth had been wounded by the runaway success of rubber and gas in the same way that Berensohn had been wounded by the runaway success of finding one's way with clay. In both cases, there's no one to blame. Earnest invention and a desire to serve are hallmarks of the Homo sapien. Berensohn wanted to connect a culture to the craft of clay. The early Semites wanted to write down their words of God. Henry Ford wanted everyone to have a car. The suicidal commonplace eco-irony is to give up because we think we can't do enough, so we don't do anything at all. But everyone in the developed nations can pivot towards the local and handmade. Craft arts become a pattern of kindness. Peaceful action can offset the addiction to technocratic mass production and runaway economic growth. It's bountiful to hold a yellow thread, pinch a pot, paint portraits of our children, and weave a line of countercultural integrity. Indra's net is also a tapestry. Counting down to some possible end of the world is not going to save us. Counting up, or as Paulus would say, singing up, the earth will. The craft arts are patient and long-suffering. Harmony, Bowman writes, is natural like the stars in the sky or a kiss between lips. Paulus writes in his classic text, Finding One's Way with Clay, an important basic principle. If you take a small ball of clay with about the diameter of a quarter and pinch hard into its center, the chances are that the edges will crack. If, however, you rotate the ball and press firmly but gently in small pinches all over its surface, while offering counterpressure with the fingers of the other hand on its edge, you will more likely be able to pinch this ball thin without its cracking. In pinching, as in throwing, as in living, the world is a potter's wheel. We are made of motion. Paulus says, the clay, the life, needs our support, a firm and tender touch, a pressing out by one hand or fingers, not into the void, but into the supportive, giving, and even resisting capacities of the other hand or fingers, and each other.